Hello and welcome. Today I am painting a cute little tree frog for Dena Tollefson's Totally Awesome Challenge, because when I was looking for reference photos I couldn't think of anybody who fitted the bill of totally awesome better than this little guy I found. I think he's actually a garden ornament, so he was so much fun to paint and draw. He really made me smile the whole time, and I hope he does the same for you. I've got a bit of a thing for drawing whimsical creatures, especially sort of anthropomorphized ones, because one of my little pet projects at the moment is getting more confident at figure drawing by drawing things that are a bit whimsical, because that gives you a bit of license. And I'll pop a card in the top right corner to show you what I'm talking about there. One of the things I also find quite fascinating is trying to figure out exactly what it is that makes us smile. What is it that is so amusing about this chap? And I think it's the shape of things like his little tummy there. He's got a sort of Austin Powers feel to him, I reckon. He's a groovy kind of fellow, very relaxed in his fantastic pose there. And you can imagine that in his mind's eye, he's a bit of a supermodel, but he's got a bit of a dad bod on him there, you know, and that little round tummy just makes me giggle, along with his kind of froggy double chin there. So you just can't help but smile as you draw, and I think that really does help make the whole drawing process seem very much easier. And I think that when you're smiling, when you're drawing and painting, your smile certainly shows up somewhere in that painting, and other people get to see it too. Now, I've been sketching so far using one of my Prismacolor pencils. It's a Prismacolor Color Erase pencil, so it does let me erase some of those marks, but I don't really intend to erase them all. I'm going for a very loose, sketchy feel, and I want the line work to remain, and I'm happy if some of that purple shows. But I also wanted to use my pen, and that's a waterproof pen there. It's a Pitt Artist's pen, and it's lovely and fine, and I'm trying quite hard to not make a solid, straight line, because I don't want him to look like a cartoon. I want more than one line in most places. You know, I want him to have a very sort of loose, sketchy, fun, quirky feel that I think really suits his sort of charm. So I'm going to go back with the pen later on, but now I can't wait to get painting. And I've got a wax resist crayon there that I'm using, because in the photo, because he's an ornament, he is very shiny, and I think that's part of his quirky charm. So I wanted to make sure that that remains. So that little wax is going on the parts that are going to catch the light. You've got to be a bit careful with the wax, because the problem with it is that once it's down, and you can't move it. You won't be able to draw on it, and you won't be able to write on it. So it's a bit addictive, and you want to use it with caution, because there's nothing you can do once it's already down. And I've started with, funnily enough, the green gold paint that I used in the very first challenge I did with Dena Tollefson. So I will pop the links to that as well in the card, in case you are new to Dena's wonderful challenges, along with the links to her channel so you can find out more about her. She's a wonderfully supportive YouTuber, and I love joining in these challenges that she organises. Now, my little froggy fellow there, I'm painting this sort of with the traditional kind of watercolorist mindset of going from light to dark. So I started with the green gold for those lightest parts of the frog, and those are generally the parts that are sticking out more towards the viewer. So where his little lips jut forward and that lovely round belly of his was the brighter yellowy colour. And then around the edges I've added slightly greener colours and a darker green. That's my sap green that I use to put in the darkest edges where his body is making contact with the ground, for example. And then he's a tree frog, so he's got those glorious orangey red fingers and toes, as well as his eyes there. And again, I am trying to loosely use the properties of the watercolour to do some of the work, in fact most of the work, in making those fingers, toes and eyes look spherical, because of the way I'm shading it there with the red and orange, but the water does most of the work in making those blends happen kind of seamlessly. And then my little chap is reclining there, but he doesn't look like he's reclining until we add the ground. So a nice contact shadow. And yes, that's that colour I can't resist. I have to do a spot of purple somewhere in my painting. And I'm choosing to use the purple both in the frog's body and on the ground to be part of the shadow. Because watercolour is translucent, those purples are going to look slightly differently. On the ground, it's going to be purple over that goldy colour, and on the frog it looks different because it's purple over the green. But there's a nice harmony because it is the same purple. And it's these shadows and light areas that bring the whole, bring a drawing to life. So I am reinforcing the darker areas with the dark green and with the purple. Watercolour softens off beautifully once you get the hang of it. You don't want the brush to be too wet, you just want it to be slightly damp so that it blurs the edge of the line that you put down. And I'm working in my moleskine sketchbook. I think you'd call it a moleskine if you were fancy. And it is made for watercolour, but I find that you can pretty much never find brilliant quality watercolour paper in a sketchbook. And that's one of the reasons I use the pen. I often find that I draw in extra materials because I know that the watercolour paint is not going to do as many of its cool tricks in the sketchbook compared to the way that they would behave if I was using proper watercolour paper. But I'm still using my favourite wet in wet techniques to put in a kind of colourful, blotchy, Austin Powers-ish background for my young frog there. And you can see that this paper actually does behave pretty well. I'm getting to the point where I'm going to have to let it dry, but of course I can't resist adding a bit of texture with some splashes. They're definitely going to soften because that top area of the page was still wet, so you can see those droplets dispersing. So it'll be interesting to see how those dry, how much they spread out. And his eyes are not quite finished because we do need to put in that dark bit, and that's when he kind of comes to life. And remember, I put a bit of wax in there, and that's where you want to be a bit careful. Like if you were needing to put the dark area in and you'd put wax down, you would have no choice but to have to live with a highlight in that particular area. Now that page is completely dry. I did walk away from it because I wanted to go back with my pen, and if you put your precious artist's pen on top of a wet page, you will damage the nibs. So you want to make sure that it's completely dry before you go back in with the pen. But I find I often do this when I'm working with an ink and wash approach, where I'll do a bit of the inking before I paint and then go back afterwards to reinforce any of the lines that I think could do with strengthening after I've painted, because some of them you lose when you paint and some of them you don't. And the other thing is, as I said, I didn't want to have him looking like a cartoon, so I wanted to make sure that there were a lot of extra loose, sketchy lines. And while I was doing that, I then noticed that I could do with a bit more darkness against his back there, because watercolour does dry lighter, so that is something you often find that you want you wish you had been a bit bolder in the first instance. And normally I do everything in one sitting, but because I went back in with the pen, I couldn't resist adding in a little bit more depth of colour in some of these areas. Also, he was just making me so happy because he's, you know, such a funny fellow that I couldn't stop. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Happy painting.